I wanted to run an experiment in WWE 2K22's MyGM mode to see how much class type synergy actually matters. We all know and hate this mechanic as it prevents us from putting on dream matches just because someone's wrestling style doesn't match up with someone else's. It's annoying, but how much are you punished for not doing it? I'm just going to lay down the rules of this run so that you know the experiment was done fairly. Every week there will be 2 matches that lined up in terms of class synergy and 2 that didn't. All rivalries will adhere to the face versus heel dynamic. I won't be touching logistics or anything that could potentially impact the star rating of the matches, so every fight will be a normal 1v1, no stipulations. Then I'll be recording the results of each match in a spreadsheet, which will then be used to decide whether they make an impact over a 15-week season or not. Also, it's worth noting that I matched each rivalry up as close as I could in terms of their popularity and star power, and tried to have half of them as good matches and half not so good to balance it out as fairly as possible. The way I'll be doing this is by simulating to each pay-per-view, then discussing the results after. This is because after 5 weeks, we'll need to substitute out the rivalries that are completed and drop in the new ones. So the first set of rivalries we had were Big E vs Orton and Mendoza vs Ivar as the correctly matched up ones, then Kofi vs Sami and Tamina vs Nia as the clashing ones. I also tried to pair up people of the same class type in the bad ones, just to make it as fair as possible, although I doubt it made any difference whatsoever. After the first pay-per-view, the best performing rivalry overall was Big E vs Orton with an extremely respectable average rating of 2.9 stars. Also, I laid out the card in the order of the matches on my spreadsheet to make it easier to track. So these 2 were always the opener and Tamina vs Nia was always the main event. But again, I'm not sure if that made a difference, to be honest. The second highest rated was actually Sami vs Kofi with a 2.6 average star rating. I was a little surprised by this as they do clash, but I suppose they both had pretty high popularity and star power going into it, so that will have been a big factor. Then the third highest was the second good rivalry, Mendoza vs Ivar, and that got an average rating of 2.4, so pretty close to Sami and Kofi. It's worth noting here that their popularity and star power was a fair bit worse than the others, so that looks like it was the deciding factor here. Finally, to round it up, we had Tamina vs Nia, and they only got an average rating of 1.7 despite Nia being very popular and having 4 star power thanks to holding the title. So from the first set of data, we could assume that the popularity and star power matters more than correctly matching up the class types. This would make sense in real life, as fans would much rather watch Sami vs Kofi over Mendoza vs Ivar, but this game doesn't tend to emulate real life very well, so this did confuse me. It was also interesting to see the difference in match quality between the 2 bad matchups. Cruiser vs Cruiser did well, but Giant vs Giant did very poorly, which is something to look out for in the next 10 weeks. So then I moved on and simulated the next 5 weeks to see whether the trends we'd seen in the first 5 would continue, and here's what I got. The good matches for these 5 weeks were Tozawa vs LA Knight, yeah, and Alexa Bliss vs Raquel. Then the bad ones were Omos vs Marseille and Daivari vs Wild. After the Week 10 pay-per-view, Tozawa and LA Knight put on the best matches with an average rating of 2.5, so not as good as Orton vs Big E, but then again, their popularity and star power wasn't as high, so it does make sense. Second was the other good matchup in Alexa vs Raquel, who got an average rating of 2.2. Then third was Daivari vs Wild with 1.6, and last was Omos vs Marseille with a measly 1.2. This went much more to plan than the first 5 weeks, with the correct class type matches coming out on top. We also saw a continuation of the Giant vs Giant match being the worst by a fair distance, so that's something to consider. Anyway, on to the final 5 weeks now as we look for definitive proof that class types do indeed make a difference. The rivalries for this period just went back to the original ones as they'd now fully reset. Big E and Orton once again came out on top with an average rating of 2.6, but only just as the other good match, Mendoza vs Ivar, actually ended up getting a 2.5. Then the Zayn vs Kingston rivalry dropped down to third with a 1.9, and Tamina vs Nia once again came last with a 1.6. I don't know whether the first 5 weeks were just an anomaly, but the ratings since then did indeed match up with the class type synergy. One explanation that I did have was that the popularity and star power were now not a factor, as they'd all been benched for a while and lost it, hence why Mendoza and Ivar now outperformed Sami and Kofi. In fact, the only time popularity did matter was in the first 5 weeks, as from then on we started with it being fairly even across the board. This to me shows that popularity and perhaps more importantly star power matter far more than the actual class type synergies. If you want the absolute best rivalry possible, then you need to make sure you tick all of the boxes, but if you want good ratings, then prioritize those 2 things above the class synergy. With that being said, at the end of the run, the 2 good matchups got an average star rating of 2.6 and 2.5 respectively, whereas the bad ones got 1.9 and 1.6. This tells me that once you remove all other factors, the synergy definitely does make a difference, but it's only a slight one. So if you're struggling for a rivalry in a run as you have no bruisers to pair with your fighter, just choose someone with high popularity and star power to pair them up against, and you should be absolutely fine. If this video piqued your interest even slightly, you should definitely check out some of our other WWE 2K content on screen now.